I wanted to go over some ego stuff. So, ego and validation, this is a huge thing that human beings are quite obsessed with. All you have to do is look at social media and you can see. Now, this is where things can get interesting. Ego and validation. So, we all have ego challenges. And you can see this in astrology by the sun sign. You can also see this in human design by the sun sign. Again, the cool part with human design is it shows there's a conscious version and an unconscious version of your sun sign or your ego. So again, there will be different gates typically. Sometimes they're the same, but usually because there's 64 gates, it's going to be two different ones. And so one of them you're aware of, and the other one you're not. Well, potentially, unless you've done a lot of inner work, you'll be aware of it. But and the interesting part when you find out about it, it might confirm things that you kind of already knew, but like you hadn't fully gotten a grasp of. That's what I like about all of these tools. But I don't notice it as much in. I suppose in numerology, it would be your actual birth date. That would give you a pretty good idea of your links to your ego. But if you want to go deeper into this, it's definitely more in the sun sign arena. So and again, in human design, the gates related to that. Obviously, it can show up in astrology in your first house as well. And I think there's some links to Jupiter. And Jupiter also plays a certain characteristic in human design. Once again, there will be the conscious and unconscious version of the gates for these two placements. And so that definitely shows us what types of things we're going to be, again, aware of and unaware of when it comes to Jupiter. The reason I say Jupiter is because Jupiter expands what it touches. So we're more likely to use the words and descriptions to characterize these things. And I've said this before, maybe not here, but I've said it in my other videos on other platforms. Jupiter is incredibly under talked about because I think it creates a pretty big influence in a person, because people tend to use the words to describe the things that they're working towards or the things that they want, the things they feel very strongly about. It tends to come out in the words used that directly describe Jupiter and the sign they have Jupiter in, which is really, really interesting. I've seen it so many times that it's it also shows it shows people's like performative sides. Again, it doesn't guarantee that, but if you happen to have more of an insecure side to yourself, but it also at the same time wants to be seen, it's going to show up in your Jupiter. How you perform that, how you try and understand and get a grip on, understanding yourself, so to speak, and what you show the world. Because again, we got to think about Jupiter. It's connected to Sagittarius, and again, this is like meaning of life stuff, right? And how do you find your meaning of life if you don't figure out what it isn't? Like, that's kind of how human beings work. We have to figure out what we're not to figure out what we are. So that's kind of what Jupiter orchestrates. It helps us kind of go through and figure out what things don't fit. And again, if you have a Jupiter sign that's not as doesn't look for patterns as much, doesn't try to uncover the truth. Again, every single Jupiter is going to be different. So again, it will depend on that. But there will be a process of breaking down of what is fake, what is false, what is not real, and then what is, so that we can figure that out. Again, I think that has a role to play in our ego. So the sun sign will give you a pretty good idea of how your ego is going to show up within you. The house it's in also, right? And now this can be tricky sometimes to determine when we look at the conditioning of human beings. So one of the things that we can kind of see, like let's just break it down into men and women, things get a little bit easier. So with women, again, and you can kind of see this, there's some natural instincts when it comes to females, even when we're younger. We start becoming very aware of how we look, of our beauty or whatever, when we start to or if we aren't very connected. Again, this is from a conventional point of view, but even if you aren't fully aware of that yet in terms of how society deems beauty to be, you start seeing little girls doing, dress ups and dressing up like princesses and whatever. Now, I know there's some conditioning because obviously what we watch in the media and whatnot, but there's this desire to be beautiful. I think part of it is conditioning, but I think part of it is also a female human thing. Again, you can see more tomboyish ones and whatever, so obviously it depends on how many feminine placements they have and how many masculine and which ones they're connected to. Like, obviously all these things are going to come into play, and it gets more complicated, as things always do. But the other thing that you can see once women kind of get a little bit older, especially with social media and the fact that we can pretty much post anything, you start to see what women's motivations are, right? So there are women who don't post themselves at all on social media. Now, in most cases, I personally think it's either they don't have something to say, or they wouldn't know what to say, or they're too afraid people wouldn't want to hear it anyways. Maybe they don't feel attractive. I think there could be a few things. But the basis normally is that particular person, maybe they're a bit more on the private side, or maybe they want to be out there doing things, but the insecurity keeps them more quiet and more hidden about it. On the flip side, you get the ones who, again, you can kind of get in between, where they've got something they need to say. Again, depending, there's fluctuations there too. Or perhaps they know they're somewhat attractive, and so they put themselves out there just to be seen. Again, this can kind of lean into other things. This can lean into just simply needing attention and validation to provide their ego with the information that it requires to confirm, I guess, well, I mean, inside they're not very secure, that's obvious, but on the outside they might require that as a little sort of shortcut to becoming more confident. It never works, of course, but that's what a lot of them do. So that's definitely one where it could be just basic attention and validation to sort of feel attractive or to confirm that or whatever it might be. A lot of other times, again, in this part of this time period, this can be related to, spicy work and whatnot. And a lot of times that's when women put themselves out like that, it could be for motivation, to motivate others, to go to the gym, or like fitness influencers, stuff like that. But a lot of times it's for the spicy content or whatever, right? So all of that is, again, it gets complicated, and it's a lot more complicated than what I'm saying, but a lot of that has to do with ego stroking and validation. And until a woman understands that about herself and starts to really work on who she is, it isn't as much needed. Again, if it's part of her work, but I still say that has its own, again, if people want me to go into that, I can, but that has its own basis where that sort of stuff comes from. The interesting part is none of this means that she's, I don't know what you want to call it, easy. None of that means that. And even still, I mean, human beings are sexual creatures. So the idea that, like I said, I could probably get into this. I probably should do a bit of a few videos about religion and patriarchy and how this all affects us. But at the end of the day, just because a woman shows herself or her body or whatever the situation might be, it doesn't mean that she's easy. And I don't actually think people are anyways. I don't think women are. I don't think men are. I think it's just a matter of, again, if we have shame in terms of sex from religion or patriarchy or whatever, it's kind of throughout history been to to blame the women because they're, seen as temptress or whatever. Again, I can get deeper into that in another video, but it's worth paying attention to the basis of that. The main thing is women are trying to embrace, their beauty. And again, if they're insecure, it comes out in different forms. They either hide that, where they don't feel they are beautiful, so, they don't put it out. And the ones that do put it out, again, those are still a basis of insecurity. There's still things they have to get out and whatever. And like I said, this society and all the rest of it, right? So that's just sort of tied in. I can go far more specific, and I think I will now that I've stepped on it, into the sort of religious side of things and the patriarchy and sexual shame and whatnot and how that shows up. Now, for men, it's quite different. For men, it's definitely more hidden. Now, this is the reason why they get addicted to porn. This is the reason why they get addicted to looking at women. So men want to, in terms of biology and whatever, women have to be careful who they procreate with because that comes at a cost. And men are kind of like making sure that the population continues. So they're not as picky as we are typically. I think they are more picky than what they've sort of become in terms of society, the way things are going. But I guess it's the whole thing of now you can kind of sit as a man behind your phone, your computer, whatever, and look at any number of women. The interesting part, though, is a lot of men that do this blame women. And again, through religion and patriarchy, that's a big part behind it, to blame women for being like temptresses or whatever. When the reality is men and women are both sexual creatures. We both have desires. We go about it differently, but there's no shame, there's no embarrassment, there's nothing wrong with that as long as it's consensual between people. And so that's one of the interesting parts when it comes with men, is men have that desire to connect just like women do, but we connect differently. So what we can sort of see, the reason why, porn has become as used by as many men as it has, men have this desire to connect in the way that they want to connect, but they can't seem to. Again, in the past, there was an entitlement issue where they were kind of, given women, I suppose. They didn't have to do anything. They didn't have to work on themselves. They didn't have to whatever. And then the women had to do what they wanted sexually. This has caused a lot of problems for both men and women in terms of relationships and sex and all the rest of it. And it's only the men and the women who've broken away from this that, have a chance at having something more real, something more connected. But you can't be caught up in, behind the computer or the phone watching this stuff because it keeps you stuck. And that's what it does to men. It keeps them stuck. If you watch that, you're not connecting to yourself. You're not connecting to women. You're not connecting to anything. And the thing that's interesting is men, they use it as a way to stroke their ego a lot, to pretend the woman that they're watching is into them, is excited by them, all these kinds of things. And when you think about how men interact with women, it's, complimenting her body and how she looks. Like, it's obvious that's what they want. They want to be complimented for how they look, for their body, to be desired that way, the way that they desire women. But women aren't like that. We're typically deeper. And I think when men start to really, when we start to sort of unpack this patriarchy problem and religion problem, I think men are deeper than that too. But they just haven't even begun to understand. They've sort of been stunted emotionally and mentally, really. So they end up finding these other avenues. And the other part that's really interesting about it, they also suppress and repress their emotions and their feelings into it rather than dealing with it. This isn't all men, but there's a lot of men that this falls into. There's nowhere for them to explore these things, their feelings, their thoughts. And so they, and it's sort of seen as weak or whatever, so they try and deny it and hide behind the stuff that they watch, kind of to push it down further, but it comes back up again. And so that's the interesting part, is there's this idea that men are these way more sexual creatures than women, when that's just not true. But women want it for connection. We want it as a way to get closer to that man. Again, depends on whether we're talking about straight or gay relationships. Obviously, the person changes, but the way that they interact, there's this masculine feminine polarity and how that shows up. I think deep down men want that too, but it's difficult for them to go through all of that when they've been forced to shut down. So it's kind of difficult to really understand how the male ego really works, how the male truly connects to himself and to others, if we don't really have a safe platform for that, when it's been something that's been made fun of or repressed or insulted or whatever. It's pretty difficult. I think that I will do some videos on that and to explore it, but until that kind of happens, I see it as that's the reason why a lot of men are addicted to porn, and just like looking at women privately, and they have this real separated, right, the shadow and who they really are. Again, you have to integrate these two things, but if you have them separated, they're fragmented. You have all these sort of, repressed emotions, repressed feelings, resentment, anger, entitlement. There's a lot of this sort of stuff that goes on for men, and it's all hidden in that shadow and in that release. So it's definitely something to look into and explore, and I don't think it's as simple as what people think it is. I think it's far more complex and too repressed. We'd have to slowly start to tick away and unpack these things to really figure it out. But I think I'll leave it there for now, but I think it's an important one to consider, and I think I will talk about some of these things going forward.